Hello and welcome to the Prefabs Getting Scene Data tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to set up our prefabs to be able to talk to the scene and get information out of our hierarchy, things that you can't just drag and drop into our FSMs. Okay, so the scene I have here is simple. I have my player capsule here. This is just so we could walk around in first person. And then I have a cube here, which has a select random color action. So it'll either be blue, white, or green. And then it sets the color of its material to that. So you'll see that if we hit play, it randomly chooses the color and then sets it as that. No big surprise here. So another thing that just happened is that an NPC just spawned to the scene. So that's where I have my NPC spawner. There is an empty game object here that just instantiates this NPC prefab. What if I wanted this NPC to get the color from this cube to make the NPC's mesh that same color? Normally, if let's just say I put the NPC in here in the scene and I unpack this prefab completely, so now it's just a regular scene object. I can come here to the surface mesh of it and I could add an FSM and I could do get FSM color and the game object we're getting it from. I could just drag and drop the cube in here from its FSM, the random color variable. And then we could store that locally into random color. Then I could do a set material color action right after that. And I'll be using that random color to set this mesh color. I'm gonna turn off the NPC spawner so we don't get two NPCs. Okay, so this is just our scene NPC. And what I'll do is just make sure these are running every frame so it's constantly updating. Okay, there we go. So it's blue, and if this changes color, our NPC changes to the same color. Okay, but if I wanted this NPC to be a prefab, I'm just gonna rename this NPC prefab to that. Okay, if I take this scene object NPC now and I drag it in here, make a prefab out of it. Now if I go inside this prefab and I go to the FSM in here, you'll see that the information got disconnected. Okay, we no longer are able to just drag and drop things in here because prefabs are assets that can't talk directly to the hierarchy until they are instantiated in the scene. So this is a very common thing people run up against. What good are prefabs if they can't even talk to things in the scene? So today we're gonna go over a few ways that you can make prefabs get information out of the scene after they're instantiated. First of all, I'm gonna go back to the scene and I'm gonna get rid of this NPC and get rid of that prefab. Yes, I'll delete it. Okay, so now we're just back with the normal NPC prefab that I started with. Okay, and we'll turn this NPC spawner back on. I'm gonna go inside the NPC, go over to the surface mesh, right? This is the one that we want to change color. Okay, so I'm gonna add an FSM to this, and we're gonna add in a set material color because it'll always have one of these. And we'll say that the color will be called random color. So that's gonna be a variable. We're gonna be checking every frame. Where do we get this random color from? So the first way that we can do this is by selecting this cube and then throwing in a get owner action. At the top up here, we're going to store the owner in a new global variable called color cube. So now this is a global variable, which means that in our prefab, we can do a get FSM color from global's color cube. Okay, and we know it's called random color, and we'll store it here locally in random color. That'll be running every frame as well. So we should be able to press play. Our NPC instantiates and matches the color. Okay, so that's like the most obvious way that you can have prefabs talking to scene objects. Now, what if you don't want to make all these game objects into global variables? It's not very smart to have a bunch of global variables in your project. You only want a few. So what you could do instead is have a game manager. I'm gonna right click, create empty. I'm gonna call this my game manager. I'm gonna add an FSM to this, and I'm gonna put in a get owner action and it'll be a new global variable called GameManager. Okay, now here in its variables, in its local variables, we can make a game object called color cube. We'll say color cube local. And here we can still drag and drop that in because this is a scene object. Scene objects can still talk to each other this way. So I'm gonna drag and drop our color cube in here. Okay, so I'm gonna copy this text because I'm gonna wanna get this from the game manager. So I'm gonna hop over to the prefab, and in here, instead of getting FSM color from the color cube, first what I'll do is get FSM game object. And I'm gonna be getting from our game manager the variable color cube. I'm gonna store it in a local variable here called color cube. I'll have this running every frame just for the example. And this get FSM color action is now going to be referencing the color cube local. So we've just added one extra step in between. Now we have this game manager, which is a global variable, so we can get that from inside of our prefab. And then from our game manager global variable, we can get that color cube. And then from the color cube, we can get that color and then set our color. So if I come back here and hit play, there we go, matches color again. Okay, another way you can do this is by also just getting the name of the thing. So this is just called cube, right? There's nothing else in our scene called cube, and that's a very important part, is that you want to make sure that there's only one thing with this very specific name, because what you could do is hop into our prefab, and then in here we will do, instead of get FSM game object, we'll just do a find game object, and the game object is called cube, and we're going to store as color cube local. Okay, the rest of it is already set up for us. So now come back here, press play, and our system still works. Okay, and you could even see here if I select our surface, right? It found it. Find game object, looked for something called cube, found our cube, and then did the rest as it should. This one you would probably want to use a little sparingly because naming objects can be a little dangerous if the names of these things are changing. And since the strings are sensitive as you're typing them in, one little mistake kind of throw things off. But nevertheless, it is still a tool available to you. It is worth noting here too that you can also use this find game object by only searching things with a tag. So if you wanted to search something by player or main camera to get your camera or whatever it is, searching by tag is also a good option. Another way we could do this is by going to the thing that actually spawns the NPC. So we have our NPC spawner here, right? It's responsible for creating this. So when you use a create object action, you have this value down here as store object. So whenever it creates an object, it'll remember the last one that it created. So you could store this object as a new variable, something called last spawned NPC. Okay, so if you loop through this state a bunch of times, this value would constantly be updated with the most recently spawned NPC. Okay, so what I could do is if I come over here to my NPC, drop down menu, the thing that's getting spawned is this root object here, this NPC, but the child of it is what has the FSM on it. So it's this beta underscore surface game object. So what we could do is in this NPC spawner, I could do a get child action. The child name is beta surface, right? That's the one with the FSM on it. Store the result as NPC mesh. And then you can have a set FSM game object. So we're telling that mesh game object, NPC mesh, that its color cube local is actually this cube here. So that means I can get rid of this NPC, hop into the prefab, come over here, and get rid of this find game object. So now it's just relying on whatever this color cube local is. Right now it's nothing, right? It has no way of getting this internally. It has no way of finding out what color cube local is internally. Right now, this NPC prefab is relying on the spawner that instantiated it to tell it what that cube is. Okay, it created it, it got its little mesh game object. And now it's telling it, hey, this cube is what you want to get your color from. But before I hit play, let me just change this. This should not be owner. This should be the last spawned NPC. Now let's hit play, and there we go. Matches the color. So those are some of the most common ways that you can have your prefabs getting information from the scene. But before we end, I'm just gonna go ahead and create an empty here and give it an FSM, just so I could show you some other actions. Because another thing that you can do is use trigger events, right? If you have colliders on things and they're set as triggers, you could store the last thing it collided with. So if you put this trigger event inside of a prefab and you had the NPC say, checking if this cube was ever a trigger, you could store the collider here, right? So you can create a new variable, last object I collided with. And then you do like a get FSM color, and you'd get the color off of that last object you collided with, right? And you'd store it as random color. Okay, so you could get them from trigger events. Trigger events are also very similar to using a collision event. You could do the same thing, store collider here, right? Anything that has this store collider value. Of course, another big one is Raycasts. So you could pop this Raycast in here, and you can have your NPC shooting out a Raycast and storing the object that it hit. Raycast hit this object, right? And then you would just change like this. Okay, Raycasts are a way that prefabs can get things from the scene. Another action is FindClosest. Okay, you can find the closest game object that's tagged something. This is a way that you can get the closest player. Like if an enemy was running around in a multiplayer game, they could maybe just look for things that are tagged with player. You would store the object here. Okay, there are many, many ways that you can get information from the scene. Okay, so those are some additional ways that your prefabs can be getting things from the scene.
Be sure to check out our other videos to learn all the various features of Playmaker. Links to more learning resources are in the description.